Greetings. Today I want to talk about something that I have tangentially touched upon in the past, and what we're going to be examining is an excerpt from a discussion between Bret Weinstein and Sam Harris on a podium they had for his podcast, Waking Up. And the context of this is my general observation that, by and large, public science communicators, and in fact biologists, and he is a practicing biologist in much the same way that Dawkins has been, have failed in their obligations to the public in terms of explaining principles of human biodiversity in their fullness. And we're going to examine some of the reasons why that is the case. So let's have a listen to Bret Weinstein explain his positions. And he seems pretty reasonable, and I don't disagree with him that cultural evolution is much faster than biological evolution. I mean, if that weren't the case, then so many of our behaviors would not be maladaptive, and they are incredibly maladaptive, particularly in the realm of the interaction between the sexes and modernity. But we need to listen to what he says with regards to human biodiversity in terms of populations or different genetic groups. So let's have a listen.
So cultural evolution is very fast. Can we account for every nuance of every religious tradition? No, and the closer you get to the present, the less likely it is to be true. But any long-standing tradition that has some large, expensive structure within it, that structure is sure to be paying the freight, because if it wasn't, some subpopulation would have said, hey, you know what? That thing's not true. Right? That's blasphemy. Let's get it out of here. And they would have won.
But when you first mentioned this notion of metaphorical truth, I was thinking of simpler things like the notion of equality, for instance, that all people are equal. Now, that's something that we assert as a norm. It's good to believe that. I think it is politically good to believe that, but we actually don't quite believe it in any specific sense. So it's like if there's a hostage crisis and one of the hostages is the President of the United States, you don't just rescue all hostages with equal priority.
You're thinking he gets rescued first or last?
Well, I guess in this case, yes. I honestly will never believe that he's President of the United States. I was thinking about other presidents. So
okay.
Every other president you go for first. But yet the equality heuristic, or the metaphorical truth of equality, I think is incredibly valuable and something we want to be aligned to. And yet it's not defensible in a fine-grained way.
It's not defensible. And in fact, one of the problems with metaphorical truth is that if you sign on to it because it has adaptive value, because it isn't stored in literal form, you can't figure out when you're in territory that it doesn't apply to, or that you should think exactly the opposite thing. So there's a hazard built into this, and equality is exactly such a thing.
Right.
I happen to believe that modern humans are, barring influences like lead in your water or something that would disrupt normal development, humans are pretty close to cognitively equal at birth. I don't know for sure that that's true, and I'm aware of evidence that points to what are called heritable differences, but that's the way I'm betting based on what I understand biologically. It does not mean that human adults are equal. Now, human adults are unequal because of all of the things that are distributed unequally that are actually providing advantage. So if we believe at all that school has a value, then certainly good school will provide extra value to people who have access to it, and by the time they get to adults, if it isn't resulting in some different level of capacity, then we've wasted, at the very least, all of the resources that we spent building those environments. So it should be true that adult populations are unequal based on what they have access to.
Now, you might be asking yourself, where is the failure? To my mind, the failure is pretty simple. Despite conceding that he's not sure, he still makes the assumption, for reasons he does not go into, which is to say he has his reasons based on his understanding of biology and evolution why he believes this, that at birth barring certain extraneous factors such as lead poisoning, etc., every human being is cognitively equal. And then the minute you move away from birth, all these differences emerge because of environmental factors. That's basically what he's arguing. And what strikes me as bizarrely obvious here are the things he must be aware of. For example, that no one in his right mind, no scientist and nobody aware of biology in general, would argue that each person's height potential at birth is identical to everyone else's height potential. Right? No one would argue that. No one would argue that every person's muscular capacity, or say distribution of fast twitch or white muscle fibers or red muscle fibers, slow twitch, will be in equal proportion or can be actualized in the same way from birth onwards, but environmental factors interfere, and that changes then the potentiality. No one would argue the same about hair distribution on the body. Some people have hairy chests, some people don't. How patterns of hair, curly or wavy hair versus straight hair. No one would argue that each human being has the same potential starting at birth, equal basically, and then from there on out there's just this mass of environmental factors that interferes and then creates these differences. I don't even think Bret Weinstein would argue that, frankly speaking. Or if he did, I would be shocked. I've not heard him to date argue that. And yet, we see him effectively committing the below-the-neckline fallacy, as it's come to be called, with regards to cognitive capacity. Now, the brain is an interesting organ in the body, and it's very telling when you examine the energy requirements of the brain. The brain is the only organ in the entire body that absolutely requires some minimal upkeep with regards to glucose, which is to say, if you're running a keto diet for a long period of time, your organs are, basic digestion, the cells throughout the rest of your body, your heart, all these things, they're running on ketones and lipids. They can run entirely on that, but the brain still requires some minimal maintenance in terms of glucose, which is then usually extracted vis-a-vis glycerol or gluconeogenesis. That's a separate topic. But the point is that it tells you a lot about the brain when every other portion of your body can run on lipids and ketones, but your brain, in the majority, can, but still requires some minimal upkeep with glucose. That tells you how expensive it is, how powerful it is, and it tells you it's very much a physical organ as well. And so the proposition that the brain is this, mystical thing, which is sort of what he's hinting at, that is equal at birth but is then modified by environmental factors, seems, in light of all the things I've adduced, and in light of the fact that no one would argue that everyone's height potential is identical at birth, absurd. Now, the alternative hypothesis has a really nice way of describing this, that is the way human beings are, the interaction of the genome and the environment. That we're all some mixture of our genes or the environment, and so asking the question, what is genetic and what is environmental, is silly. He uses the analogy of the cake. What part of the cake is the ingredients, and what part of it is how the ingredients are baked in? Or what is the difference in terms of baking time between such cakes? That's his analogy, which I think is a good one. So it's kind of a moot point, but the point is that no human being has the same potential at birth as another human being. We're all different, and this would have to include cognitive abilities. And so why Bret Weinstein insists that hedging his bets based on everything he knows, he believes that every human being born is cognitively equal at birth, and then as they stride forward into adulthood, all the environmental factors take hold and alter things. And no doubt, environment has some effect on cognition. But if you've looked at the data, we know that IQ is highly heritable. In some cases, it appears to be more heritable upon reaching adulthood than things like height. And so you can have, it's theorized, more effect on a potential height outcome than you can on your maximum cognitive ability, which is roughly, I'd say, would roughly correlate to IQ. It's not a perfect measure, but it's something. So what's happening with Bret Weinstein here? Well, I think he's letting his ideology take over. Now, years ago, before Stephen Jay Gould passed away, he was vehemently opposed to the idea of what he referred to as biological determinism or what have you. And he didn't really support the idea. And why did he not do it? Because he was an avowed Marxist, a declared Marxist, but he was ideologically driven. Now, everyone knows the story by now about Bret Weinstein, namely that he worked at Evergreen College, and he got in this shitstorm, which was basically something that you could describe as his own children devouring him or attempting to. I mean, he's a progressive to this day, and you could say a true progressive. I heard some story about when he was an undergraduate at University of Pennsylvania. Don't quote me on that. I don't remember the exact university. He protested some Jewish fraternity's denial of access to black people or something. That's how progressive he is, despite him being a Jew. So, yeah, he's very progressive, and I think this is his ideology interfering with the actual data. Now, if he would actually take the time to examine things, I don't think he would have made that statement. And another point on this is that even if one were to concede that everything is effectively environmental, as which is to say how the cake is baked and how long it's baked, we don't have perfect control over our environment, and thus we're still going to have all of these uneven, inequitable outcomes at the end of the day. And so this form of progressive thought that he seems to be an exponent of, I've seen him speak on other matters, and so I would say it's pretty consistent with his line of thinking, is unachievable in reality. It's a denial of the tragic vision of life and the world. And I wish he would examine the evidence a bit more. But what I see here is not the first time I've seen something like this. This is a failure on the part of a public figure who's a scientist and a biologist to acknowledge certain factors and work with the factors as they exist rather than what he wants them to be. And then, of course, you also get people like Richard Dawkins, who doesn't really comment on these matters as much, but he definitely holds his tongue because he wants to maintain his reputation and keep it intact before he dies, at which point in time it doesn't even matter. In fact, who knows, maybe he has a memoir that he's been writing that's going to be published posthumously, and it'll say all kinds of unpleasant things that normally would get him in some hot water these days. And this is, of course, related as well to my critique of Jordan Peterson. These people wield immense power in the sense of they have very large audiences, they can reach people, and thus they are perfect filters for actual education and actual scientific data. Now, Peterson on occasion has talked about these things like IQ, although he doesn't really go into mean differences between groups, I think for obvious reasons, and there are other questions that he avoids, like the plague, also for obvious reasons. I think we know the particular question I'm referring to. But nevertheless, something such as banal a statement as saying not everyone is born cognitively equal, and then as they grow up, they're beset by inequalities and inequities. That is not something that a public scientific intellectual, and a biologist at that, such as Bret Weinstein, should be saying, because it's not correct at all. Whatever his well-wishing might be, whatever his own examination of the points of data might be, it just doesn't make any sense, because no other attribute of human beings is seen this way, and he would acknowledge that. So what do we do? Well, once again, the only thing we can do, if we're YouTube content creators or whatever, is to push for these ideas and try to get the facts out there to as many people as possible. Because people like Weinstein, Peterson, Dawkins, all these people in the know are not willing to risk their necks, understandably to some degree, to explain these things and to put them out there. Once we have these facts out there, once we have this information out there, we can then engage in discussion about what to do with it, if anything. It might be, and I'm increasingly inclined to support this outcome, or the possibility of this outcome, rather, that there's nothing we can do. As I said, there are inequities, there's inequality. We're all born with different potentials, and then there's a host of environmental factors and so on and so forth. I mean, it might be that we just acknowledge it and say there's nothing we can do about it, and we continue about our business as if nothing had happened. There might be other consequences. There might be things you could implement politically. There might be policy changes. We don't know. But as long as we are hiding from this information, hiding ourselves from the information, hiding the public from the information, rather than disseminating it liberally so people can make up their own minds by looking at the data, we, that is, people who speak of these topics, are doing everyone a disservice. And the people who are most irresponsible in this regard are people like Bret Weinstein, because perhaps he sincerely believes this stuff based on his own ideology, but frankly speaking, I'm a bit skeptical of that. And a cursory glance at the data that's been aggregated for IQ and related issues would tell you otherwise. So I hope in the future that he changes his tune, and he might not shift his own political ideology, but he will at least acknowledge that not everyone is born cognitively equal. It's an incredibly asinine statement to make, and it doesn't really compute in reality. And there are consequences to spreading this type of misinformation. Everyone, thanks for tuning in. I will check you out possibly in the future if I'm still alive. You take care and enjoy your forthcoming weekend. Bye-bye. If you liked this video, please like, share, and subscribe. And if you enjoy my content, please consider making a donation or becoming a patron. Thanks for watching.